And I frankly want to talk about a team that we talked about quite a bit during the regular season, not so much since the season has ended. That's the Georgia Bulldogs. So Georgia, obviously, look, we know that they had an incredible regular season. Started the year number one, deserving number one, two-time reigning national champions coming into the year, start 12-0, and then they lose to Alabama in the SEC championship game. Ultimately, it happens. Alabama's good. Only one team is going to be able to hoist that skinny trophy at the end of the year and call themselves national champions. And so I bring it up because after Georgia lost that game, we kind of moved on. But then a funny thing has happened with Georgia over the last couple of days that has certainly created a lot of narrative on social media. And I wanted to bring it here today because I thought it was at least an interesting conversation. And that narrative is this: based on the fact that Georgia absolutely destroyed Florida State. And you can debate Florida State didn't want to be there, who cares? The bottom line is Georgia showed up. Georgia showed up on a mission. Georgia showed up on a mission to prove that they're the best team in college football. Destroyed Florida State 63-3. And following that, there really was kind of this renewed push that somehow Georgia belonged in the college football playoff. I bring it up because this was especially interesting. It came from the Hard Rock Bets Twitter account. Now, Hard Rock is a popular hotel and casino down in the Miami, Florida area. I am here to tell you, I've been to that casino. It is a great spot. Great spot. Neither here nor there. I was with family, so I didn't do anything wrong. You check the security cameras. Torres was on his best behavior, okay? But great casino. But they put out a post on social media, and it very simply said this. This post came on Monday. This came on Monday from the Hard Rock Bet account. It says, hypothetical spreads if these teams played Monday night. This is, of course, after the semifinals when we know that Michigan is going to play Washington. According to Hard Rock Bet, Georgia would be a 2.5-point favorite against Michigan in a hypothetical national championship game, and Georgia would have been a 6.5-point favorite versus Washington in the national championship game. Now, to be blunt, these conversations kind of annoy me. But it was clear that people were very passionate on both sides of this topic. What would have happened if Georgia got in? Did they deserve to be in? Whatever. And so I decided to bring it here. But rather than just bring the conversation myself, rather than just me spit out 8, 10, 12 minutes of conversation, what I decided to do was instead put it out on social media. I wanted to see some responses. So I put it on both Twitter and YouTube. And I basically asked a simple question. If Georgia was in the college football playoff, do you believe they would have won it? Why or why not? On Twitter, as of, it is about 7:15 Eastern time. As of right now, the poll on Twitter, 70.4% said yes, they believe Georgia would win it. 29.6% said they don't believe Georgia would have won it. On YouTube, 63% said yes, 37% said no. And let me tell you this, before I give you my opinion, there were a lot of very passionate responses to this answer, okay? So a lot of people believe the answer was yes, obviously 70% on Twitter, 63% on YouTube. Among the people that said yes, Shredder on Twitter said the SEC title game this year reminded me of the last time these two teams played. Obviously, that was the national championship game 2 years ago. Georgia is superior and, in my opinion, the best team in the country, but they played their worst game of the year versus Bama, obviously due in large part to Bama. So Shredder says yes, he thinks that Georgia will win the national championship. Crimson Knight 35 on YouTube had an interesting comment. He said, I hate to say this as a Bama fan, I believe Georgia would have beaten Bama in a rematch. I also think Georgia would handle Texas and Washington. I think Michigan is the best team this year, and I don't think Georgia would have beat them. I believe Michigan beats Washington 28-16. This Michigan team feels like they're destined to be champions. As far as the no, now I will say the no part of this conversation got people very fired up. AJ Southward said they would have lost to all 4 teams in the playoff. That's via YouTube. College sports super fan on Twitter said, this is disrespectful to the teams that are in it. Not everything has to revolve around the SEC. It's funny that he says that because my buddy Mike Luke, who of course covers Arizona, a really good friend of mine, he put out a semi-joking tweet in his own right. He said, what Aaron is asking is, should the playoffs have been Alabama, Georgia, Ole Miss, and Tennessee? Mike, I love you. That's not what I was talking about, buddy. And then, and Mike knows that too. Here for a short time says, No, the SEC was not very good this year. The Big 10, Big 12, and Pac-12 were better across the board. Not sure I agree with that. And then Dion from YouTube, I thought, said the best part. He said, really stupid question. It gives Georgia fans a mental championship, and they can still be mouthy and cocky, even though they failed to make the playoffs. And so the question now becomes, Georgia would have been favored over Michigan in the national championship game. They obviously would have been favored over Bama because they were just favored over Bama 3 weeks ago in the SEC championship game. They would have been in the playoffs, certainly would have been favored over Washington, and I believe they would have been favored over Texas as well. So my question, the question that I will answer now, do I believe if Georgia was in the college football playoff, they would have won the national championship? I'm just here to tell you it's a dumb question, a dumb conversation, and I think even the logic behind arguing for Georgia is dumb, even though they were a great team with a great season. First of all, let me start by saying this. If the argument is they destroyed Florida State in the Orange Bowl, sorry, that doesn't count, okay? The win counts. It counts in the win-loss column. That they get a trophy for it. But come on. We all know that Florida State did not care. Now, to Georgia's credit, they showed up. They wanted to prove a point. They wanted to prove they were the best team in college football, and they certainly laid it on Florida State. But Florida State was down 30 guys. Now, to be clear, to be fair, even if Florida State, basically, let's put it this way. Even if Florida State had the team that won the ACC championship game. So Jordan Travis isn't coming back because he's hurt. But even with that defense and the skill position guys, they're not beating Georgia. They're just not. And by the way, Florida State, I didn't really do the Florida State rant because we didn't really have time. Florida State, I'm over you. It sucks that you got left out, but you, like Georgia, had a chance to prove to the world that you were scorned and you chose to whine and complain for a month straight. So I'm sorry, credit to Georgia guys for showing up, but I also don't think using Georgia as validation is reason enough to say that they belong to be there because they won by 60 in their bowl game. Two, what I would also say is this. I found it very interesting that even when the playoff field was announced, I don't think that anybody truly in their hearts believed that Georgia should be in the playoff. But what I did hear was a lot of this. Well, if you're moving up Alabama past Florida State and using the very vague best term, then you have to do it for Georgia as well. There is no one that would argue that Georgia isn't one of the 4 best teams in college football this year. Now, do I believe in my heart of hearts that Georgia's one of the 4 best teams? Absolutely. Do I believe that obviously Vegas thinks the same thing, or at least the sports books? I do, because Hard Rock bets seem to indicate that they think that Georgia would be favored against pretty much everybody in the playoff. At the same time, though, the case for Georgia as one of the 4 best teams is actually pretty thin. Don't give me the 29-game winning streak. Guess what? That includes last year and the year before. Don't give me, they didn't win the SEC. The biggest game of the year they lost. There's 2 teams in the playoff now, Michigan and Texas, that beat the team that you lost to. So I don't want to hear it. And by the way, this is the part that drives me crazy about this conversation about hypothetical point spreads. First of all, I'll say this, and I'm rambling. You know what I hate more than anything in sports? The piece of content that I hate more than anything, and I know I'm going in a different direction, I'll circle back. The number one thing that I hate in all of sports, social media, is when a website or a writer or a podcaster or whoever does a redraft, right? Does a redraft. And what that means is somebody goes back and says, well, in this year, the 2013 NBA draft, if we did it over, Giannis would be the number 1 pick and he would have gone to the Cleveland Cavaliers. It's yeah, but we're not doing it over. And Giannis wasn't the number 1 pick, and he's not going to Cleveland. So I don't care. And so ultimately, I don't really care about Vegas point spreads, but I also hate the conversation that the Vegas point spread tells everything there is to tell about a story, about a matchup, about a team. Listen, I'm going to be careful playing this is why we play the games on the field card, because Florida State fans are going to get mad at me. But the games on the field we can't just go strictly by Vegas point spreads, right? Because if we went strictly by Vegas point spreads, I get that Georgia would be favored over Michigan. But guess what? Michigan just played Alabama. They beat Alabama. Guess who Alabama beat before they played Michigan? It was Georgia. So I'm not going to feel sympathy for Georgia fans and assume that they would beat Michigan just because some hypothetical point spread says that. This is why we play the games. This is why we play the game. Herm Edwards, you play to win the game. That's what this is right here, right? Just think about it. The argument that Georgia would be favored over Michigan, who cares? We actually got the matchup that got the matchup. Georgia played Alabama. We knew that was a play-in game when it happened. We knew there was no real scenario that the loser was getting into the college football playoff. Georgia lost to Alabama, and Alabama lost to Michigan. So I don't care that Georgia would be favored over Michigan in a hypothetical game. It doesn't matter because the games were actually played. By the way, if we're going to go by fake hypothetical point spreads, go back to Monday night. Texas was a favorite over Washington. Washington won on the field. Does that mean that we're not supposed to count that result and we're just supposed to move Texas along to the national championship game? Of course not. So spare me with the point spreads. I'm not sold that Georgia is a definitive top 4 team. They lost to Bama. They're not better than Bama. Bama lost to Michigan and Texas, so you can't tell me they're better than those 3 teams. So at best, you're arguing that they're better than Washington, who, oh, by the way, has beaten every team on their schedule, Oregon twice, Texas once, et cetera, et cetera. So it sucks that we did not get to see Georgia in this college football playoff. What I will say, here's the good news. Georgia fans, if you're mad at me, if you're going to crush me, if you're angry, whatever, here's the good news. Next year, we get a 12-team playoff. And the one thing I will say more than anything, everyone's excited about the 12-team college football playoff. I am too, but I'm not excited just because of the games on the field. I'm excited because we can end these stupid arguments off of it. Kirby Smart, so fired up, so angry after that game, saying, we have to fix everything. Well, we did fix the playoff. We did fix the postseason. We get 12 teams in next year. A team like Florida State will never exist again. There will never be an undefeated power conference champion that does not make a 12-team college football playoff. So Florida State will have the chance to prove it on the field. Probably wouldn't have won the national championship this year without Jordan Travis. On the inverse, what I'll also say, Georgia will have a chance to prove it themselves next year. And that is the one thing I will say, Georgia fans. This year, there were only 4 spots. It sucks you weren't in because you were probably right in the conversation as one of the 4 best. But you didn't have the resume. The 4 teams that got in were probably the right teams. Florida State probably had more of an argument than you. But guess what? 12-team playoff era doesn't really matter. You go 12-1 and lose in the SEC championship game, you're getting in that college football playoff, and you are going to have a chance to prove the doubters wrong. But do I think that it's some incredible miscarriage of justice that Georgia was not in this college football playoff? I don't. It stinks this year. I would have loved to see it, but ultimately, I still stand by what I said a month ago. I think the committee got the 4 teams right. I wouldn't have put Georgia in over any of them. I think Florida State had more of an argument than Georgia. And the great news is you get to settle it all on the field next year.